Hi everyone, this is Deanna from Generation Cult. I'm about to play you a rebroadcast of an episode from season 2. So this one aired back in 2019, but it serves as a companion to the new episode that we have coming up. On the new episode, we'll be speaking with some writers who have been covering a reparations program that ended recently through a group called 3HO. This interview that you're going to hear right now is with Narangkar. She grew up in 3HO. It stands for Happy, Healthy, Holy Organization. The guru, who's now deceased, was Yogi Bhajan, and he brought Kundalini Yoga to the West. Narangkar was one of the first other second-generation adults that I ever met. I think I met her back in 2013, and we did this interview in 2019. And she talks about everything she experienced through 3HO's strict child rearing policies, including its abusive boarding school in India, which she did attend. So here's the interview, and make sure you come back for our next episode because it does relate to this.
Hello, my name is Narangkar Glover. I'm in my 40s. I am an artist, and live in Portland, Oregon. I was raised in the 3HO Sikh Dharma Kundalini Yoga group, religion, whatever.
Well, welcome. Thanks for talking to me today about it. I always want to give people an idea of the group we're discussing. In your group's case, I know it has several different names, so if you wouldn't mind giving me like a rough rundown of what it was.
The group itself, I think, should be denoted as 3HO. It was started out as the Happy, Healthy, Holy Organization. The reason why I call it 3HO Sikh Dharma and Kundalini Yoga is because Kundalini Yoga is sort of the trademarked brand of 3HO. So it's sort of nested within 3HO, but it's specific to 3HO. I use 3HO Sikh Dharma because Sikhism is a religion. It's an actual religion, but people in 3HO have adopted Sikhism, but they sort of tweaked it to be a little bit to their own flavor of westernized, kind of almost Americanized, westernized, and maybe even anglicized Sikhism. I want people to know that Kundalini Yoga is like inextricably linked with 3HO Sikh Dharma and that they're not separate entities, that the word Kundalini comes from ancient yoga, whatever. They're all connected, yet they all kind of I believe they try to kind of chameleon themselves into society through using millions of different terminologies to kind of find what fits. The person who founded it, who started, his name is Yogi Bhajan. He also went by several monikers. He was an ordinary Punjabi Indian who traveled to the United States in the 60s.
Was he based in one particular place and there are multiple ashrams, or how was the organization set up?
That was exactly how it was. The people, his devotees, would go out and start ashrams in various cities all over the country and now all over the world. Their job, they were instructed to teach Kundalini Yoga to, the general public in whatever town they were in. My parents got married. They were instructed to go move to Hartford, Connecticut and teach yoga and soft recruit, maybe. Like they weren't really supposed to be enlisting people in the organization, but doing weekly yoga. But then there would be other areas of the country with massive, maybe hundreds and thousands or maybe high hundreds of devotees. And so they would kind of become like a nucleus for the organization.
Okay. And how did your parents get involved?
I think kind of complicated. On my mom's side, my grandmother was the first person. And my mother's sister was 9 months. No, not even. She was pregnant. and the father of the baby took off. So they started enrolling in these yoga classes in Orlando, Florida. And then that turned into a joining in and becoming kind of. And as when my aunt was nearly due, she was told to marry my uncle, who's now my uncle. She was told to get married. At the time, my mother lived in Boston, Massachusetts as kind of a hippie. She was told, your sister's getting married in a week. Come on down and come to the wedding. And my mom was a little bit taken aback. She swore to herself, I'm going to go down and do something about this. Sounds like she was pretty conflicted about her sister marrying a complete stranger, but she went down to Florida and my aunt got married, and the next day went into labor and had her first son, my cousin. And then my mom stayed and decided this is awesome. So she's there. And then my dad hasn't ever quite given me a full, clear picture of how exactly he ended up in there, because they both ended up in Florida. He just told me in kind of one word, or one sentence, I was an idealist.
So there was an ashram in Florida.
There was an ashram in Florida, and it was very loose, and it was very idealistic and very hippie. And I do know that when my aunt, when she went into labor, that would have been September 1971, and by December 1971 was when my parents got married.
Oh, wow.
So that's
quick.
That's kind of all I can make sense of it, is like the timeline of just 3 months later, both my parents were hitched. It was like random pairing, like you man over there, this is the woman you're going to marry. And it didn't sound like my parents were particularly thrilled, but they went ahead and did it anyways. I'm not sure they even really cared for one another personality wise. I think they agreed to something that they probably shouldn't have agreed to. Yeah, and then they basically just hitched and conceived and had 3 kids right in a row. And then once you're there, you kind of are committed.
So what was your parents' living situation when you were born?
So I was born into a house. Our house was almost a solid nuclear family household. We were in Hartford, Connecticut, where there's these huge old houses, and they're humongous. My parents would rent or buy. They eventually bought a house that had enough space to have a little gurdwara for the Sikh stuff, a little yoga room, a sadhana room, we called it, and a dining room, a full, almost commercial kitchen, a huge kitchen, and enough rooms to have probably 3-4 families living there. So it was a one house ashram, and people would come and go, and my parents were always the ones that stayed there and kind of were the ashram heads and kept it going. And, maybe it was a fact of the matter in the early 1970s. If you weren't clean shaven, you probably couldn't get a job. So all of these early 3HO people were entrepreneurial and started their own businesses and really pulled themselves up and made something of themselves. Yeah.
And several of those businesses are still around, yes. Right? They became very successful.
Some of them became huge. Some of them were always just kind of baseline entrepreneurial, regular kind of growth. Some of them were instigated as kind of big companies, and are now massive companies.
Well, what are some of your early memories of growing up in, it sounds like it was an ashram that was contained within your parents' house. Is that correct?
Yeah. There was my early memories from Hartford were just, almost idyllic. I remember people coming and going. So I do remember even people who had been just let out of prison, living there for a little while, kind of in a transitional phase. I remember communal dinners. The adults, I remember the grown-ups getting up every day at 3:30 in the morning for prayer, which we called sadhana. We had a really easygoing kind of ashram where the kids didn't have to get up that early. We had to get up at around 6 o'clock, and we did kids yoga, and there was like whoever was, usually it'd be like a mom or a woman or young woman who lived there who would do the kids yoga, and they would make it fun for us. We had a very loose ashram. And I guess I'm comparing it to some of the other ashrams, which weren't loose at all, were really, really rigid, where kids did have to get up at 4 in the morning and do sadhana with the adults. Yeah, growing up in Hartford, I'd say it was pretty average.
And is that where you stayed? Did you stay in Connecticut, or did you guys move anywhere else?
Well, things changed. God, I mean, if I would have grown up that way and stayed that way up until my adult years, I'd be telling a different story. I'd be all about Sikhism and Kundalini yoga probably, but who knows how a cult leader alters course. But the first sign of it was when every summer, women were instructed to go to a camp, their own women's training camp. And when women were going to these camps, they would last about 8 weeks long, and they were in New Mexico. The children would go to children's camp. So we went to long, really 8 weeks of children's camp out up in the high desert in northern New Mexico, in a completely undeveloped area with there might have been running water, but no hot water, living in tents and I was as little as 5 when we started doing that. And the point of these camps were that we needed to detach, that the word started going out there that attachment to parents was wrong. That being attached to your children, especially the message was going out to the parents, not the children, but that if the parents were creating an atmosphere of attachment, that they would make us all neurotic. So they just sort of programmed in these really exhausting, long children's camps that, we'd even see our mothers sometimes and we wouldn't get to say hi to them or hug them or talk. We'd see them in a bus and the bus would drive by and they'd all be waving happily at us and we'd be in tears. Because why is our Mataji driving by?
So describe these children's camps. What did you do? What was it like?
Nothing. These camps were, I was so little, but these camps were for me like just boredom, just nothing to do. There was no activities set up. And if they were like grueling, like you'd have to go on a hike in the hot sun in the hot New Mexico desert, and the food was really bad. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I'm sure. And we had yoga, probably. My memories of children's camp are really kind of fuzzy, actually, because my mind was, when is this going to end? I want some real food. This sucks. I hate it.
So you were like 5 when this was going on?
I was 5, 6, 7, yeah.
And your family was in Connecticut, but they would send you guys.
My mother would have been in the women's camp, which was also in New Mexico, but in a different area down the hill from children's camp. And the men were instructed to stay home and take care of business. Very patriarchal, and women would be going through a series of lectures and training programs, martial arts, guns, just weird. It's too much. It was all meant, the way it was all phrased to the women and the men and us was that it was meant to be restorative, instructional, useful. The women would be learning how to be women, and the men would be learning how to be businessmen, and the kids would be free to play and learn about sing and play and learn. And it wasn't meant to just cast us aside, but definitely there wasn't a lot of programming going on. Like, there certainly weren't a lot of adults, the adult to children ratio. So a lot of sitting around doing nothing.
I want to talk about actually when I first met you. You made a presentation. You're an artist and you were presenting your art. And one thing about your story that really, really struck me was this one painting of a little girl laying at the bottom of the cliffs, and you described what happened. Tell me about the painting.
Okay.
Tell me about this painting.
It was sort of like the end of quote unquote school, because I don't know if I want to call this what we were doing school, but it was the end of school and there were grown-ups. We were doing little field trips. So we had gone with the little Cossack school program. All the little kids took us to Nambe Falls in New Mexico for a field trip. So it wasn't during camp. It was like kind of before this all took place. There was a group of us, small group of kids.
And how old were you?
So I must have been 6.
Okay.
And she was 6 too.
You were young.
7.
Okay.
Maybe I just turned 7, because if it was 81, I had just turned 7. But yeah, little kids. And she was the same age as me. And they took us all in a passenger van, drove us out to this great swimming hole. It's a great spot. But it was one adult for maybe 12 of us kids. And so once we got to the swimming hole, some of the boys started running up the cliff, and Navjiwan went following them. And just like that, she fell. And so it was like, it went from sunny to gloomy. Like, on all of our minds, everything changed. What I remember, and that's why I did the painting that I did, but what I remember is being caught up in the swimming hole and having fun clambering around rocks, and then hearing kind of like a, oh no, what just happened, kind of, you know, how things go silent, and looking over and seeing her down on the ground, like in a kind of a pile of lava rocks. The rocks in New Mexico are really hard and sharp. And just kind of curled up in a ball, like in a fetal position, like looking like she was asleep. So I didn't see anything happen, but what I saw was just like, she had huge like gashes, kind of like ripped from her skin, like huge cuts all over. If I'm getting too graphic, it's because I saw her so like immediately after she fell that she hadn't even started to bleed yet. It was like so weird, and like it was just such a snapshot. And then that slowing down of time just sped up again really fast, and the adult that was with us picked her up and ran back out to the parking lot and left us all to sit there for however long. So 11 other kids, or 10 or 11, or however many of us there were, just sat there in a little grassy area in the swimming hole, crying and praying. Like, I remember us saying, we don't know what to do, let's chant. So we started chanting. It was deep down in a ravine, and once the sun started kind of going behind the cliffs, we just kind of had to resolve to do something. We couldn't just sit there overnight, so we just decided, okay, let's all get up. And then we just said, you know, we have to move, we have to do something. By the time we went back out to the parking lot, which is like a good quarter mile, maybe half a mile of a hike in a river. You have to like go through this river. I don't remember how we got help. My sister told me that some hippies helped us use the payphone.
So what made you want to paint about this experience?
I think that it was challenging myself to try to gain some kind of kernel of crystallization of some moment of conveyance of the idea that a memory is kind of like a snapshot of a moment that's so filled with mood and emotion. And it was like challenging. How do you put into pictures a snapshot from your mind without any photographic reference, without any other context? You know, because in the painting, she doesn't really look dead. She looks exactly how I remember her, which is like curled up in a fetal position and sleeping, like peaceful in a way. Like, so it was challenging myself to do something like convey a emotion and a memory rather than tell a story.
So after that, were children cared for better at that point? Was there less, I guess, neglect after that point? Or did things change? Did it change anything?
It didn't change anything. And if anything, things continue to get more and more extreme. Unfortunately, that episode, that event, that death, unfortunately for me, it was the precursor of my life being totally altered for the course of my childhood, because whatever moment of pause it would have given to any of these members of 3HO, it either didn't last long or it didn't exist at all. The children's camps remained about equally neglectful. Then the Yogi Bhajan started instructing parents to do away with this attachment thing and to do away with the nuclear family idea and to swap children from ashram to ashram. My sister had already been swapped for a year. She had been living in Espanola, New Mexico with a family all by herself with nobody. And then when we in Hartford, someone lived with us whose parents lived in New York. That summer, I was told, along with my older sister, to stay in Ramdas Puri and live with these two people. We were just going to live with them in Ramdas Puri in a trailer in the same exact location as our children's camp. So yeah, that was the worst. It was just, that was neglect through and through. That was just, I don't even want to relive it, but we lived with these total fanatics, total checked out. Who even knows what was going on with them? And the dad was just this checked out guy, and the mom was just this uptight fanatic. She just bossed us around. She made us do chores all day long. She didn't cook for us. Food became a major issue for me. If someone wasn't going to cook for me, I just said, no, I'm not. If you're just going to give me boiled mush, I'm not eating it. Fuck off. I was pretty picky and they couldn't convince me. They couldn't even punish me to eat. So I would just go on strike.
Wow.
So food became the crux of my emotional reality of if the food is good, I'm taken care of. If the food is bad, these people don't care about me and I don't care about them. It was really this basic human, response.
Okay, so you've been swapped to this other family. How long did you end up staying with this other family before your living situation changed?
Thank God we were pulled out of that once something bad happened. And it was actually kind of one of the minor bad things that happened. These people treated us so bad. They sent us to school in dirty clothes. One time, this is coming from my aunt. She was the one living in town at the time and teaching art projects to the kids in the school. Being a pretty positive force, I would say. Cooking, she made us pies a lot, so she was great. And my older sister came to school with a heavy coat on. And she said, geez, Onkar, why are you wearing your coat? It's so hot, take your coat off. And my sister started to cry. And she said, well, let's see what's going on here. And she opened her coat and it had spaghetti sauce all spilled down the front. And so I don't remember that, but I remember my aunt saying that was what she called my mom and said, this can't happen anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just feeling like I just got saved. Like we got to spend the night. We got to go stay at my aunt's house, and she made us burritos, and we got to go home. And like we just put it behind us. And I just checked out I was like, whatever that was miserable. I never want to go through that again.
So then what changed? Like, how long were you home or in Connecticut feeling safe before anything changed?
Well, not very long. I think I finished second grade and started third. And then midway through third grade, it was decided that we were all to go to India, to boarding school, instead of swapping kids around. Because I assumed this child swapping was a disaster around all over. And it just abruptly came to a halt. It was like, nope, that experiment didn't work. So the next experiment was to send us all to boarding school in India, to a Sikh boarding school where we would learn about Sikhism and we would absorb the Sikh culture and the Indian culture. And that was kind of about it. That was about, I'm sure the attachment thing was still being hammered into our parents. But for us, we were sold a bill of goods. All the 3HO parents had to do some major convincing to get their kids on board with going off to India.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what did they tell you?
They told us there would be horses, there would be swimming pools, we would learn Gurmukhi, which is the language, Punjabi, basically. We would be walking in the footsteps of the gurus, which are the Sikh prophets. They said we would get to go to the Golden Temple all the time, which is the main holy site. They just said everything was going to be perfect. And so, I think for me as a child, I would have been 8 at the time. I think I was numb. I was kind of like, I didn't care. Like, I didn't care if it was true or not. There was a part of me that was just like, tell me whatever you want. You're making me do this. I wasn't pushing against it. I wasn't fighting it, but I also wasn't saying like, oh, yippee, we get to go where there's horses and pools. In a weird kind of way, I didn't. I was numb.
What was the camp like itself? I mean, were there horses waiting for you when you got there?
No, there were no horses waiting there. Oh gosh, it was bleak. It was a boarding school. It was full of gravel, and it was like a very rigid, traditional Indian boarding school. It was structured. It was rigorous. It was authoritarian. But I just remember us just being like little orphans. We were crass. We were unruly. We didn't ask for what we needed. And when we did, we didn't get it. Like we were like automatically autopilot survival mode. We developed a habit pretty early not to ask for help from grown-ups. If they told us what to do, just to do it and move on. We wouldn't glom on to grown-ups. We would just sort of hope that they moved on to another purpose at some point.
And what were the people in charge of you like?
It was a mix. So the school itself was a traditional Sikh Indian boarding school that was kind of modeled after the British boarding school system. Then there were a group of, say, these American chaperones that then sometimes, quote unquote, looked after the American kids. They were kind of oppressive and heavy-handed. They disciplined, they administered their own discipline against only the American children, separate from the school altogether. So the way the teachers would discipline us would be pretty heavy corporal punishment, like a Catholic school from the 1940s. They'd whack us on the knuckles with rulers and make us do little punishments where we'd have to stand on a chair forever. And some kids got, like, some teachers would whack kids on the head with a spoon. And so in a way, it was like accepted as the norm. I think what I'm getting at here is when the American chaperones administered their quote unquote discipline, it was random. It was aberrant. It was not, you do this, this is going to happen. It was more like bullying. The breach or the betrayal of trust by the American guides, which is what we called them, was a more bruising thing emotionally for us US kids. They would emotionally bully us. They would physically bully us. They had their own way of being cruel that had nothing to do with just straight up black and white discipline.
So were you reporting back to your parents? Like,
yes,
did they?
We were.
Okay, so what happened with that? Like, did your parents believe this was happening, or?
Yes, I think they believed it. No one disbelieved it. It was too obvious, too right in front of your face to not believe it. You couldn't not believe it.
Didn't you tell me about, there was one guy there who was particularly harsh?
Right. Yes. And he was so harsh. He was an awful, horrible, terribly cruel sociopath who had been appointed to look after the children. I think the reason why I'm not even saying his name is because I really want to convey that he set the tone and that other adults followed suit and did some of the same stuff he did. So he typically physically attacked boys, but then he physically assaulted my own sister. And what I remember from that is that it was a specific kind of retribution, being that we got to go home for part of a holiday. Some of us kids whose parents could afford it could send us home. And when we got back, he paraded around those of us children who got to go back home as a bunch of pussies. Me and my sisters were part of that little group that got to go back home and then be with our parents. What I remember as an 11-year-old, I remember it being so scary. Everyone was scared. Everyone was terrified of this environment that we were in. It was so oppressive. We got back to India and we were there at this little place in Rishikesh for the rest of the break. A kid pulled us aside and said, "You better watch out. He is going after everyone. Just stay away from him." Fortunately for me, I was young enough where I did get to stay away from him, but my older sister got plunked right into his group and he made them all go play soccer, and the losing team had to run laps around the field as punishment for losing. She was running slow. She was probably really jet lagged. We had just gotten there. She had just gotten her period. She was not feeling it.
And she was like, how old at this point?
12 and a half. Someone started bopping her in the back of the head saying, run faster, run faster, run faster. And she'd be like, I can't run faster. All I remember is someone running up to me and saying, Narangkar, your sister's being beaten up. And I was like, come on, Surji, like my younger sister. And we ran and we just stood outside of the room and he was gone already. And it was just this really creepy, ominous vibe. And we weren't allowed to see her. We weren't allowed to hug her. We weren't allowed to find out what happened. We couldn't make sense of our own feelings. We had no idea what was going on. There was another adult in the room trying to tell her, you'll be fine. All you need is a little bit of rescue remedy. That pretty much was a no-brainer. This man is beating girls in closed rooms with other kids, keeping watch outside, making sure nobody goes in.
Yeah.
And he did that to, there was a couple other girls. Then what he did was he told the kids who were being bad in that way, like the ones who deserved his wrath, that he would make them carry around about a big 10-pound stone, like a big rock. And he called it an ego rock. And he'd make them carry it for like a month or a week. And everywhere they went, they had to take this giant rock. And other adults started doing that too, saying, you're being bad, you need an ego rock. And they made a little like 6-year-old girl carry around like a big giant thing with, she dropped it on her toe and broke her toe.
Oh
I mean, it was just
yeah. And at no point was there any adult who stepped in and said, this isn't okay.
Supposedly there were, but they were silenced right away. They didn't mean anything. They didn't matter. If anything, they were going to get beat up too. Like, it was such an abusive, the umbrella of abuse was just so wide and so confusing for the kids. But yes, there were adults there. There were adults who knew about it. There were adults who objected. There were adults who said, if you ever do this again, I'll kill you.
To the other adults.
And then they went back home and did nothing.
Oh my God.
So I don't know why. I do know. I know why. I know why he was there. I know why no adult had any power to stop it. I think we all know why.
Why?
Well, because it's a cult. And Yogi Bhajan was saying, don't make waves. These kids deserve what they're getting.
So how long did you live in this environment? Like, what span of time were you living in India at this boarding school where all of this was happening?
It was my whole childhood, all the way up until graduation, till I was about 16.
So from 8 to 16, this is basically how you live. Well, and how was the education?
At this traditional boarding school, the academics were pretty strong. I wouldn't say they were good, but there was a focus on academics. There's a focus on test taking. And if you did well academically, like if you had an aptitude for learning and absorbing material, then you would be fine. So you pretty much, it was kind of like a sink or swim environment. If you got it, great. If you didn't get it, you failed. So the academics were fine, but then the school changed. We got kicked out of that school. The American Sikh kids got kicked out, told to leave. So they went ahead and got funding and started their own.
Oh.
That boarding school had much weaker academics, much weaker structure, kind of just a mess. So that's where I spent the last 2 years of my schooling in India. This ad hoc school just was a disaster. So parents were starting to be really concerned about their children's futures. There was a military school in New Mexico, a United States military, like a traditional military school, that agreed to take us and let us keep wearing our turbans. And so that's where I spent my next year. First year of college was at this military school. That's where we got integrated with the American kids. Those of us coming home from India were in a state of culture shock arriving in the United States. I mean, we didn't belong in India, but we didn't belong in America either. There was no home. There was no identity aside from being a little Sikh kid. You know, we could sort of we could become Americans a little bit and sort of find our identities. And that came with learning what Americans did in high school, which is usually party and drink and whatever. So we started doing that. And then our parents who sent us to this military school freaked out and said, well, if they're going to be getting corrupted there, we don't want them there. So they immediately took me out. I just insisted that I wanted to continue studying and going to college. And so I got to go to a college in New Mexico. We had to kind of insist on our own education at that point. At some point, my parents got divorced, told, you can't go to college anymore. You need to work for one of our businesses.
So what was your reaction to that? Were you connected enough to this group that you wanted to stick around, that you wanted to get married and you wanted to go work for a business? Or like, how were you feeling at this point? I assume you were around 18, 19? Yeah, okay.
I was so conflicted because my identity was a Sikh. I knew about Sikhism at this point. I had spent 8-9 years in India learning about Sikhism, learning Punjabi, learning Hindi, getting to know Indian culture. I saw myself as a Sikh. I saw myself as a member of 3HO, but I also saw a whole wide, interesting world out there. And I have a curious mind, so I saw myself as I don't know if I saw myself as worthy of saying I'm going to do what I want to do, but I remember feeling kind of a sense of feeling of betrayal upon returning home from India and then just being flung into this weirdo community. We were told that we were in India to kind of get away from the weirdo parents. Like, that's what we were told as children, that your parents are too weird. You can't trust them. And then we had to be back with our quote unquote weirdo parents. And we had to listen to what they said. And we had to do everything that they did. And we couldn't stray from the way of life at all. And it felt more oppressive. Like, India felt more free. Like, we would compare it, like, in India, I got to do whatever I wanted, honestly. And here, I don't. We really liked skateboarding and heavy metal and rap. And like, as kids, we liked all that stuff. And our parents took all of our heavy metal stuff and gathered it all up and threw it in the dumpster. Like a good old book burning kind of thing. Like, they said heavy metal was negative, threw it away. And so they were like really like coming down hard on us with a lot of negative reinforcement, a lot of like, you can't do this, you can't do that. And as they were coming down hard, some of my peers had been getting told that they have to marry a man. And it was always a girl peer of mine. Like, no boys were ever told they had to marry someone. So girls were being instructed to go off and marry a man, some stranger who was usually a good deal older. They were just kicking girls off lists and telling them, you have to get married. And that was, to me, the thing that was the no deal. That was no deal. You had two opportunities as a girl at that point. You could be told who to marry, or you could live with your lot in life, and that would be it. Go marry a stranger and make a life, be their wife and have babies and whatever. Or you could not do that and not marry anyone and not have a love life at all. There was no in between. There were no people choosing to marry each other. And the other weird sort of psychological manipulation that goes with that is that people who didn't want to rebuke that system, like, and say, okay, I guess this is just the way it is, so I'll be lucky if I get picked. To me, there was something deeply offensive about the idea that someone would consider themselves lucky to be told who to marry.
So how did you get out of it?
Well, I was one of the people that knew that I wasn't just going to marry someone. I wasn't just going to get picked off a list. They had ways of making girls feel like their value was 100% based on what men thought of them. So I somehow was one of those girls that knew already that men didn't think of me as attractive, but also lucky me, you know? So I think I just started experimenting and going out and meeting people and partying, going to raves and taking drugs and just finding a world that was somewhat different than the world of 3HO and meeting boys. It took a while, but meeting boys who I had such an affinity for, like such a friendship with and such an affinity and like felt like connected to rather than looked at.
Were you still living with your parents at this point when you were branching out, or had you moved out?
I lived with my mom when I was first branching out, and I was slowly getting weirder and weird, not weirder and weirder, different and different. Didn't want to wear my turban. I started dyeing my hair different wild and crazy colors like pink and blue, and listening to a lot of techno and just kind of being a little more overtly rebellious. And I think it got to a head where she kicked me out.
Your mom?
Yeah. And I went to live with friends who were in college. And so that's when the official break happened.
And did your parents break contact with you?
Yes and no. My dad left also at the same time. Like, he left 3HO when my parents got divorced. That was why they got divorced. So he kind of became a little bit of an absentee, went off to kind of recover and figure out what the heck this was all about. And then my mom sort of withheld and kind of shut me out. Like, she just didn't. If I called her, she'd talk to me. Like, she was never mean to me. She never said, I will not talk to you again. You are not my daughter. But it was more of like, a subtle shift of, well, I just won't call her. I'm not thinking about her. So we don't have a super close relationship. I would say her sisters and brothers-in-law might have been a little more overt in excommunication, but she was always kind of a little more subtle.
And do you have a relationship with her now?
About as shallow of a relationship as can be. I've tried. It's been about 25 years being on my own.
How did you become the person you are now? Like how did you kind of pull it all together after your experiences with the family swapping and with India and this abuse, like coming out of this part of your life and into where you are now? What was that like?
It was it's still like a never ending transition. I don't even think it's ever going to be complete. But growing up in India, I do think gave me and the other kids who did it a real sense of independence and kind of survival mode and a good ability, maybe not good, an ability to be chameleons, to navigate and to perform. For me, there were these various external factors that would come into my life and teach me a little something. And when early on, I'd go to raves and really spend the whole night dancing and just observing and watching all the really beautiful goings on of all the flavors of people that would come and go and all the joy that could be kind of created at these events, and taking LSD. And these things were actually things that sort of put little pinpricks in my mind of the world being an okay place and not full of sin, and that sin isn't really a thing. It's something we've invented, and that we don't need to feel bad about where we are and being into what we're into. What I mean to kind of get at is that external thing, even that LSD and that music and that atmosphere was just a tiny little click of, so now you can be creative if you want to be. So that kind of led me to want to go to art school, and just going to art school and meeting just the most free creative spirits that came from all over the country, all centered in this one place at California College of Arts and Crafts. Just people from the most diverse and eclectic and free-thinking places. There was no wrong way to think. There was so much openness to everything, which can sound a little scary if you're coming from a cult because you want to be kind of guarded. But being exposed to experimental film and things that seemed like they could have been from another planet slowly started drip dropping into my being as a way of just developing some critical thinking. I think that I was always torn and conflicted between, do I tell my story in this environment or do I pretend to be another person? Do I navigate without the load of growing up in India? And I still don't know how to do that. I still feel sometimes like when I tell my story, I'm exotifying it, or I'm normalizing it, or I'm doing something that I'm betraying someone somewhere. It's a process.
Tell me about you now.
Okay, so I'm middle-aged. This is interesting. It's a really weird place to be because I'm just figuring it out. I think I just hit another milepost. I don't know. I feel like all of that searching, all of that critical analysis, and the deep psychological stuff of the processing of this experience through therapy and through reading and understanding and critical thinking, it was so therapeutic in my 30s. And today, now I'm a working artist, I'm a massage practitioner. So I'm just kind of an average Joe, and I'm married. I don't have kids. I'm lucky that my husband, who I actually met way back in art school, never grew up with the heaviness of religion. We talk a lot where we both kind of agree that we're atheists. And So 2 questions I'm having is, should I have been doing more to help like the younger India kids, the younger kids who are just now graduating? Is there anything I can do as a middle-aged survivor of this group who seems to have come out on the other end with some clarity and some understanding? Or do I do both, like continue self-improvement? I feel like the last 20 years have been about like not self-involvement per se, but like self-reflection and really like trying to understand and make sense. Then meanwhile, there's other kids coming out of this school in India who are going to go through the same stuff I went through, but they don't know that they can. We're kind of like a diaspora, and they might not know that they can talk to somebody. They might not trust us. They might be tired of the older generation bragging about what it was like at our school. Our school was different. You know, they might not want to hear that. So I would like to make bridges to that generation.
Do you feel like you still feel the effects of what happened to you as a kid?
Yes, I think I do. And you know what? Is it just me, or is it everybody who grows up like this or grows up in an abusive, neglectful environment, that part of you wants to hold on to it and catalog your memories? Like I've been a real, like almost like obsessive cataloger of memories, and so I can tell these stories almost as if they're written or something. But it's something I've hinged on so fundamentally that it's like, I don't think I've missed out on life. I think I've really tried to live my life to the fullest, but that it hinges, like something is always hinging. There's something that's always going to make me feel like I'm different, that I don't fit in, especially in areas of, say, quote unquote, assimilation and getting along. That's a tough one. Like if you're expected to just go along, like that hurt. That's a yucky, awful feeling that triggers a lot of anger. So I'm not very community oriented, and that kind of puts me in a weird place as I get a little older, because, you know, community, I guess, is still good, but there's so many trust issues.
What do you want people to know about kids raised in cults? What do you want people to understand about people who went through what you went through?
We all probably have some post-traumatic stress that we're confronting and that we're living with, but that we're not pathetic, but we are not freaks. And we are not victims, but we are also not privy. We are people who are caught in the middle. And we are people who have been shaped by highly destructive ideas. And if we're here today, we're probably still carrying a little bit of that indoctrination, but we are not that. I guess we are not defined by it, that we are individuals and we're survivors, I think. So how does the world reckon with survivor adults? Like, we don't want to coddle, but we also don't want to brush it off, right?
Yeah.
And also that we're really good chameleons and really good performers. And so to make room for creative expression, always teach empathy, because we are lacking in that area. Even if we don't think we are, we are. If you're good at empathy, you will be a good role model for someone who grew up in a cult, I think. And if you don't possess empathy, and if you are someone who sees the world as your object and your playground, and aha, isn't that funny? Aren't you a freak? You should not be friends with a grown-up who was a kid in a cult, because eventually that relationship's not going to work out because we're just too sensitive, I think. So we're kind of like in a weird place.
Well, that was very interesting. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to me. Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for your time, and sorry for taking you back through some of those painful memories, but I'm really glad you shared them, and I think they'll make an impression on other people. Okay, well, thank you so much.